This is the Earth. The question that was put forth in the 16th century, 17th century, is this the center of the universe? Is everything revolving around this? Or is there something else, like the sun, that's at the center of the universe, and instead the Earth is revolving around the sun? This is the heliocentric controversy. This is heliocentrism. Today we need to discuss the scientific revolution, but to do it, we need to focus on one issue. And so what we're focusing on is the heliocentric controversy, this concept of, does the Earth revolve around the sun? Now, let's start. The scientific revolution is a problematic term to begin with, because when we think of revolution, we think of armed forces kind of invading, right, or rising up, shall we say, and this was not. This was a group of typically wealthy intellectuals all over the Europe, actually thinking and passing information back and forth over a period of 150 years. But that aside, it was revolutionary in terms of the fact that once some of these ideas were out there, they changed everything. And they started a spiral of activity, which we're going to see is hard to take back. But let's start, because to start with this concept of what is at the center of the universe, we have to start with a guy named Aristotle. Plato. I take that back. And Plato said that this is a ball. And this is a ball because this ball has inherent ballness. It is inherently a ball because it is inherently what it is. It's based on basic observations, right? A chair is inherently a chair. My glasses are inherently glasses. Therefore, a peasant is inherently a peasant. A king is essentially a king. It's the essential idea of matter. Well, Aristotle took this on, and so did a guy named Ptolemy. Ptolemy. And they looked around and they said the sun rises and it sets. Therefore, it's clearly moving around us. Therefore, we are the center in the sun, and everything else is clearly moving around us. Okay. Makes sense. That logic stood. And it made sense with the Bible when the Bible was written, or maybe the Bible was written based on it, and it stood for centuries and centuries, millennia, actually. But at some point, people are going to start looking. And Copernicus is one of those people. He's a Polish observer. He's not an astronomer, he's not a scientist, but 1473 to 1543, he started thinking about this and saying, maybe it's not the Earth that everything is rotating around. Maybe we are actually rotating around the sun. Now, he couldn't prove this, but this is the idea. It's a perfectly circular orbit, and we wouldn't know the difference, right? Which way this is happening. Well, obviously some people didn't like this, but a guy named Johannes Kepler, several years later, in 1571, will actually take a separate idea, and he actually observes it. He actually stands and he watches and records night after night and says, you know what? Not only is that true, but the Earth is not revolving in a perfect orbit. It's actually revolving in this weird kind of elliptical orbit. And he's recording these actual movements. Well, this is what we call the heliocentric controversy. If we go to our map, you see the Earth in the center with the Moon and Mercury and Venus and the Sun and then Mars on up to Saturn, right? Well, this is what Copernicus said, that it's the Sun and we are just the third rock out, right? And we know that actually these are not perfect circles, as Johannes Kepler said, they're actually elliptical, but please understand what this does. Um, the one thing you've known in life is that you are on this great, big, immovable object. And it doesn't move. Try it. Stand up. Jump. Jump up and down. Did the earth move on your feet? Well, actually, it did, technically. Yeah. But, actually, it did technically. Go take physics. But, no, it doesn't seem like it does. So that's obvious. You know that. It's a big, unmovable object. But that kills your confidence, right? I mean, it's if you accept that you are not the center of the universe, that has to change everything you think about who you are, what you are, and what everything around you is. And it doesn't make sense. It doesn't. Until you learn to accept that humans are really not that important. But it goes much further than this. It goes to the church. There's larger social implications due to biblical stories. There's the story where the sun is kept in the eyes of the Philistines by God, which allows the Jews to pass them out of danger. If the sun cannot be kept in place by God because the sun cannot be stopped in the sky, because it's not actually in the sky, it's not actually rotating, then all of a sudden you have this issue of questioning the Bible's basic authenticity. And if you question one thing in the Bible, doesn't that break down everything else in the Bible? Quote, "And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher? Soon the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and hastened not to go down about a whole day." Joshua 10:13. In addition, quote, "The Lord set the earth on its foundation, it can never be moved." Psalm 104.5. This says that the sun is rotating around. The earth is an unmovable object. Except if we're rotating around the sun, we're not. Ask me about fornicating furniture. The issue gets deeper. Alright. But there's one man that takes this a little bit further. Because Galileo actually, he observed this. He builds an early telescope, not the first one, but an early one. And he is the first guy to actually use it to stare at the stars and observe. And in doing that, in staring at the stars and observing what is going on, he actually scientifically seems to prove that heliocentrism is real. There's also a whole Jupiter's moon thing and that, but what I find interesting is how he takes heliocentrism to the next step. Because instead of just looking at the sun, he looks at the movement of the moon. And as he's watching the movement of the moon, he notices something about the moon. He notices that the moon is imperfect, that it has bumps, that it has hills, that it's all scarred up, and that it's not perfect. And that it seems like it's the same stuff that is down here on Earth, because it seems like it has the same valleys and mountains as are here on Earth. Which means that if it's in the heavens, and the heavens aren't perfect, and the fact that they're the same as what's here, then that means the stuff on the moon is the same as the stuff on the Earth. Which means the moon is really no different from the Earth. It's made of the same stuff, which means matter is essentially matter. The same stuff here is the same stuff there, which means it's all made of exactly the same stuff. Now, that sounds kind of silly and neat, but not real controversial, except the fact that it says, the heavens aren't inherently special. But take that to the next level. Because once you write something is no longer yours, somebody's going to interpret that. They're going to say matter is matter. The moon is essentially the same as the Earth, which means all things are essentially the same, which means I'm essentially the same as you, which means things like a peasant is essentially the same as a king. And if a king is essentially the same as a peasant, if matter is matter, then all of a sudden a king's no longer special. A king's no longer divine, absolutist, divine right. That innate importance goes away. Now, Galileo didn't say this, but it's not a big jump for people to make. more importantly, there's something called transubstantiation. When a priest is giving communion, he stands up and he waves his hand over bread and wine, and he is physically able to, through the grace of God, to transform that bread and that wine into the actual body and blood of Christ. It's physically transformed. Well, if we go back to Galileo and matters actually matter, then that bread is actually bread and wine's actually wine, and you can't physically transform the matter because it's all the same stuff, which means transubstantiation's a myth. It can't actually happen. He is not going against the church. He is not going against anybody. He is simply making observations and drawing very basic scientific conclusions. But it's what people start looking at. It's how people start interpreting the ideas that start a tidal wave of ideas that take us into the next level. And that next level is enlightenment. But that's for another lecture.